You're listening to Platform Six Cantina, a Star Wars The Old Republic podcast. We're glad you could join us.
Welcome to the Platform Six Cantina Podcast. I am Bodie.
And I am Mara. And this is Proclamation 4, Arcann's Romance and the Enemies to Lovers Literary Trope.
That's right. Picking up where we left off in Proclamation 3, this proclamation also pays tribute to the Arcann romance, one of the most beautiful and profound love stories that exists in Star Wars The Old Republic, and possibly in all of Star Wars and beyond. To us, Arcann's romance is utter perfection in every regard and is one of the only love stories that we find ourselves gravitating towards. A tale of courtly, transcendent love and respect that beautifully embodies the successful telling of an enemies to lovers story. Also in Proclamation 3, we did discuss the Arcann romance and how it exhibits traits of courtly, transcendent love, which is commonly seen in literary fiction.
Yeah, so you should absolutely check that out if you haven't already.
Yes, you should.
Because it really is the holy grail of romance in our eyes. And the reason why we're talking about these literary conventions and tropes is because we find that they just work so extremely well in Arcann's romance. And I say this as somebody who has studied and taught English literature, and also as somebody who reads a lot. I'm telling you, I have scoured the earth for these particular romance tropes. And outside of classic literature, I've had really bad luck finding any that I liked until I came across them in a Star Wars game in Arcann's romance. And I think that's pretty incredible, because I don't think that this is the kind of content that a lot of people would turn to first when looking for courtly love and the enemies to lovers trope done really well.
That's true. That's really true. Who would think to look to a game, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we know that there are probably a lot of people out there who spacebar through a lot of these scenes, and that's a tragedy. Take it from us, it's a tragedy. You're missing out on some top-notch content, and we are very picky about romance. And as Bodhi said, we rarely enjoy romance in fiction.
Oh God, that's so true.
It's not the genre that we gravitate towards at all, usually. But, you know, take it from us, this is as good as it gets. The only complaint you could really have, in my opinion, and I'm sure Bodhi agrees, about the Arcann romance is that there's not enough of it.
I could always use more Arcann romance.
Also, considering that we only have a total of about 6 minutes of Arcann romance, there is so much there to talk about. I mean, there might not be a lot of it, but there's a lot of meat on it. There's a lot we can say about it, and there's a lot of character development that takes place in just those couple of scenes.
They do the character such justice and actually elevate the character of Arcann to another level, right, of character depth and story. It's absolutely incredible. And that was, if you recall from Proclamation 3, that was the main selling point as to why we loved the romance so much. It's one of the main pillars,
absolutely,
of our love of the romance.
Yeah, because what we're really interested in is character development. We're interested in the psychology of romance and love as it's depicted in fiction, and particularly in this story. And that's why we're talking about tropes. Yes.
Should we just start out with the definition, or maybe some examples of the enemies to lovers trope? That reoccurring element or motif.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So as you just said, a trope is a recurring element or motif. So that's what we mean when we talk about tropes. Something that we see repeated over and over again in stories. And a trope that's seen really often in romance fiction is the enemies to lovers trope. And it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's two characters that begin as enemies and then go through a transition in their relationship and eventually end up as lovers. And this is a trope that has actually been around for a really long time. Some of the earliest examples I can think of from literary history of this trope are found in Shakespeare. As an example that I think any of our listeners will recognize, I can mention Romeo and Juliet. Which, if you Google enemies to lovers, I'm sure you'll come across Romeo and Juliet's love story. Although I have to say, Romeo and Juliet are circumstantial enemies. They're not actually, I mean, they don't hate each other. It's just that
Their
their
families
families,
do. Yep. Their
exactly,
families.
their families do. So they also fall into the star-crossed lovers trope, which is something a little bit different, which has to do with fate and being fated to fall in love, but just have obstacles that you can't overcome, so you can't actually be together. And of course, it ends up in tragedy. And Shakespeare also used the enemies to lovers trope in other ways where it's framed in a slightly different way. One of the other Shakespeare plays where we see the trope is in the play Much Ado About Nothing.
Yeah.
About Benedict and Beatrice. They may not be as well known as Romeo and Juliet. And unlike Romeo and Juliet, it's not a tragedy. It's actually a comedy. And and they're not enemies in the sense of actually meeting on a battlefield either. They're enemies in a social situation, and the fighting they do is entirely verbal. So there's a lot of verbal sparring and battle of wits in that play. So it's a comedy, and it's actually described in the play as a merry war between these two characters who just try to take each other down verbally all the time.
As opposed to maybe with the, lightsabers.
As opposed to with lightsabers.
Or the Force.
Exactly. And actually, I think Benedict and Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing, they remind me quite a lot of Han Solo and Leia.
Leia.
And the way that they also, have a war of wits, and they definitely deny their feelings for each other, and they have verbal sparring throughout the story until there's a recognition that, okay, we actually do like each other, and we're actually on the same team. And the other example I can think of from literary history that I think will really stand out to most of our listeners is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which I will admit, even though I have a background in English literature, I am not a Jane Austen aficionado by any means. It's not really the kind of novel that I gravitate towards. I know much more about Gothic romances. I know much more about genre fiction. And the kind of enemies to lovers trope that you find in something like Jane Austen, again, it's very much this verbal sparring. The two characters in that novel, Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, start out from a point of personal animosity where they really don't like each other, and it's largely based on a misunderstanding. And I feel like that's the case with this trope in a lot of literary fiction, that it's based on misunderstandings in social situations as opposed to being true enemies on a battlefield.
That's a great point.
So I don't know, Bodie, what examples can you think of? Maybe also from popular culture. I mentioned a couple of examples from literary history, but does anything come to your mind when you think enemies to lovers in fiction?
There's nothing, honestly, that's really true enemies to lovers trope that I can personally think about. And I'm talking about going through my entire library of media to look for, and there's nothing that really fits this except for this romance. For me, from what I've been exposed to, at least.
And I think we have to mention too that when we have trouble thinking of lots of examples of the enemies to lovers trope, it's probably because, as we've already said, neither Bodie or I tend to really read a lot of romance, because I know that this is a very popular and much used trope in the romance fiction genre, but I just don't really read romance, so I don't really come across it very often. I have come across it in YA fiction, which if our listeners don't know, stands for young adult.
Okay,
I see it very often in young adult fiction. Unfortunately, I have not come across it in young adult fiction in a way that appealed to me personally. And I'll get into some of the reasons why that is later on. Yeah. So, the only other examples I can really think of this trope where it's true enemies to lovers is actually in Star Wars. We do have Revan and Bastila from
There we
KOTOR.
go. Yep.
And I think it's interesting that one of the only other examples that I can point to is from the Old Republic in Star Wars. Also in a story that involves a redemption arc, because Revan obviously also goes through a redemption arc. And another thing that comes to mind is the Dark Horse comic Tales of the Jedi actually also has a number of characters that you could argue embody this trope. Nomi's Sunrider and the character Ulic Qel-Droma. I don't want to give any spoilers, so I don't want to give too many details about their story, but there is a redemption arc for the character Ulic in the Dark Horse comics. And even though they don't start off as enemies, something happens between him and Nomi Sunrider where they definitely are enemies at one point in time. So I recommend, if you haven't, for our listeners, if you haven't played KOTOR, Knights of the Old Republic, the single player game, if you haven't read the Dark Horse comics, Tales of the Jedi and Dawn of the Jedi, you should look for this trope in those stories too, because you will find representations of it. Having said that, I think we both agree that it doesn't really come across any more clearly or any more successfully anywhere than in Arcann's romance in SWTOR.
Let's talk for a second why this trope means so much, especially to us in regard to Arcann's romance. I did find something I wanted to read to you and see what you thought about, which is a pretty cool quote, in my opinion, that kind of speaks to this.
Please share it with us.
Okay, good. Okay, so check this out. The enemies to lovers trope holds hope. Hope for the malleability of human relationships. Hope for the potential for someone to change. The possibilities of enemies to lovers reminds us all that human relationships are not static. Two people can grow together through working through their issues, understanding one another, and then fostering something beautiful from that process. If someone makes a bad first impression, they are not forever trapped in a fatalistic fortress from the other.
And I love that in the quote you just read to us that it said that hope is inherent to this trope.
Yes.
Because I think that's why this trope works so well actually in Star Wars stories, because Star Wars is also, it's essentially a hopeful universe, and Star Wars stories are supposed to deal with moving from darkness to light and end with hope. And we see that in the redemption arcs, but we also see it in the romantic relationships that we find in Star Wars stories.
I mean, that is the whole message, right? Hope. There's always there's always a chance to atone for past transgressions. There's always a hope to change or overcome something that has occurred in your past. That's not just something from the story, that applies to everyone's lives in real life here. We have things we have to overcome and deal with on a day-to-day basis. What kind of message is it if something was basically saying there is no hope? There's no hope for redemption for you, regardless of what you've done. If you have that will within to change or grow and learn from something, then you should be possibly provided with an opportunity to make that adjustment in your life. What kind of message is it to say that there's no chance for that hope long term? That's the message from Star Wars, right? New hope, right?
Absolutely. A new hope. And sometimes in Star Wars, it's generational. Obviously, we do have love stories in Star Wars that end in absolute tragedy, like for Anakin and Padme, but there is still hope. It's just generational. It might happen a generation or several generations down, but there's always the potential to turn back to the light and to find redemption and connection with people, as Luke does with Vader in the end.
Right. So that's in itself is what's so wonderful about this romance. Arcann does make that step to change. There are a wealth of people around him that are there to support that growth and foster that growth. And that in itself is something beautiful as well. Enemies to lovers reminds us that villains can become heroes, especially in a culture where the hero to villain pipeline is often more explored through story. If you think about that, that's interesting too. When used in conjunction with redemption arcs, the enemies to lovers trope becomes even more moving. As long as the story does not imply that the ex-villain, Arcann, ought to receive a love interest as a reward for becoming good, a story can show that an individual doesn't need to be perfect to be deserving of love.
That's an amazing quote. I mean, that describes Arkann's romance so well, and I think it really goes a long way to describe why we find this trope so satisfying in his romance, because it elevates the redemption arc.
I know. Exactly. How can anyone be against this? How can anyone not support a redemption arc?
But that's actually a really good question. How could anybody be against this? Because speaking of the enemies to lovers trope, if you Google that trope, I think you'll very quickly find out that a lot of people find it pretty controversial, actually. And you'll find articles discussing, is this trope toxic? Is it problematic? And that's something that we're going to get into.
Let's talk about, why is this trope so popular?
Yes. Okay.
Let's discuss that.
So in general, I think this trope is really popular, and the reason why we see it repeated in romance fiction and love stories so often is because the stakes are really high. There's a lot of potential here for emotional intensity and dramatic tension, which obviously is something that most of us crave if we want to engage with a love story at all.
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't like that drama? You want to see the change.
Yeah, exactly. And it's satisfying to see characters working through something, which is also what you described before, Bodie, when you said that it elevates the redemption arc. It heightens the tension between the characters. Also, I think that you have to understand your enemy really well in order to defeat them. And I think that's what actually leads to empathy and love in this trope. Because when you have two characters who are enemies, it's like a point scoring exercise. It's about finding out how to push each other's buttons and finding each other's weaknesses, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So, I mean, once you know how to really push another person's buttons, you actually have a high level of emotional intimacy with that person. You've come to understand them pretty well. And I think the step from that to actually having empathy for what they might be struggling with, from being able to put yourself in their shoes, it's not such a big step. So it sounds weird maybe at first that you can come to love a person that you once despised, but when you really think about it, if this is your arch enemy and you devote your life to defeating this person, maybe even to the point of being obsessed with this person, you start to see why, it might actually move from anger and hatred to passion.
And not to mention the fact that they're already on their minds, like rent-free, 24/7, essentially.
Yes.
Right?
And I mean, I know I can think of a couple of examples of how that comes out in Arkann's romance, and also actually before the romance. I'm thinking specifically of the scene where we go to join the Mandalorians under Venice, and Arcann realizes in the throne room that, the Outlander must be there because they've never fought like this before.
They never fought so hard before.
Yeah, you remember that
scene?
Yeah,
he has epiphany. He's like, the Outlander is there.
Yes, and he stands up
from the throne, yeah.
You can see his eye widening, and and I mean, you have to be pretty obsessed with somebody to even make that connection. So I feel like even, and I think we both agree that it's unlikely that the developers and the writers even thought about adding a romance to his story at that point. But the groundwork is already there because he already has an obsession going with our character, and they're already enemies, and the way that they relate to each other is actually, there's a high degree of intimacy because it's about Valkorion, which is, Arkann's core trauma is about Valkorion. And also I'm thinking about a line that he has in the first romance alert on Must Regret, where he says, until now, I only felt hatred for others, especially for you. I remember our character having a look on their face when he says that, where they sort of look away a little bit. And I think we need to return to this at some point when we do a deep dive into into that scene.
On Mass Regret. Let's go.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe it plays out a little bit differently depending on who your character is, because their faces can look quite different and the facial expressions read differently sometimes depending on what kind of face you've picked. But at least on my Jedi Knight, I felt like she had this moment of, oof, that made her feel something when he said that. Like she's thinking back to when they had this intense emotion towards each other. Maybe it's a little bit painful to hear him say that. And I think it's because it brings back, again, that emotional intensity of having once been enemies. And even some of the lines that our character can say to him while we are his enemy, especially if you pick the mean option, dialogue option number 3.
Oh yeah.
Actually makes her sound like she's pretty obsessed too. Bodie and I played through Wrath and Ruin chapter 1 of KOTET the other day. Do you remember, Bodie?
Yeah, I do.
Do you remember what our character said to him?
It's awful.
Yeah, and she said it's when after the boss ritual, after he's been healed and he's running away and he's about to get on the shuttle, and our character calls out to him. And if you pick dialogue option number 3, which we tried for the very first time,
yes, oh.
And our character said, "It's over, Arcann, surrender, or I will hunt you to the ends of the galaxy." And that's a pretty obsessive thing to say to somebody. Yeah. So I feel like this, this passionate hatred or obsession goes both ways, actually, for both characters before the romance even starts. Or it can play out that way, at least depending on what dialogue options you choose.
I do have a question for you. And it pertains to something Arcann says, which I think would be a good segue to another discussion or another variant of this trope, where Arcann actually, one of the things he says, if you right click on him when he's actually out as a companion, is like, he says, "We make better allies than rivals," which I think is very interesting. And I kind of question that word at the end there. But I wanted to get your take on enemies to lovers versus rivals to lovers.
That is such a good question, because the two things are very closely related, but in my opinion, there is definitely a difference. So if you're enemies, you're fighting for opposite things. It could be that you have opposite philosophies, that you have ideologies that are just in complete opposition to each other. So you're fighting on different ideological sides. Or it could be that you are on different sides in an actual war. So the goals are in opposition to each other. So that's if you're enemies. But if you're rivals, you essentially want the same thing.
You're competing. Yeah, you're competing for the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So the difference is enemies want two different things that can never align. And in order for enemies to become lovers, somebody has to surrender or be defeated. Somebody has to completely change their mind, which is why it ties in so closely with the redemption arc, I think. Because usually in the enemies to lovers trope, one person is the villain or more of a villain than the other, at least, and has to change their ideological standpoint or the goal that they're pursuing in order for the characters to become lovers. But for rivals to lovers, all that really has to happen is that the two characters have to realize that they actually want the same thing and then start pursuing it together instead of competing,
cooperating
with each other.
Exactly.
So what do you think, Bodhi, for Arcann and our character? Are they rivals or are they enemies?
Well, it depends on how you play the character, right? Your character. So, like, for example, my infamous dark side smuggler, she's terrible person. So I can see in Arcann's dark times, I can see them rivaling each other for maybe power of the throne, but for the majority of my other characters, they're not after the same things whatsoever. I mean, they don't want to be emperor, empress, or anything like that. They don't want Valkorian's power, acknowledgement, or even respect. So the line that he says is interesting. If I were crafting that sentence, I would change it to enemies, to be honest.
It is interesting because I think you explained it perfectly, that essentially if you're playing as a dark side character, then they are probably rivals, because the only thing that they could be competing for would be the throne and power and possibly Valkorian's recognition and respect and even affection, although we know he's not capable of giving that to anybody. But if you're playing as a light side character, they're definitely enemies, because there's no way that your light side character would be pursuing the same things that Arcann pursues during his dark times.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would change that if I could. Not that I'm trying to change anything about this character, but I would like to see it some other way. Is there anything in the game, Mara, that reminds you of the alternate trope, the rivals to lovers? Because I could think of something.
I can think of something too.
Okay,
And
you go.
I'm pretty sure we're thinking of the same thing.
I think so too. Go ahead, you first.
I'm thinking of the Trooper Eric romance.
Yes. Yes.
I think Eric and the Trooper are a really good example of rivals to lovers, because they start off with having animosity towards each other. They're definitely competing for a position in the hierarchy and for a leadership position.
Yes.
Eric very much questions the Trooper's ability to lead, and he wants her to sort of prove herself. He doesn't disrespect or belittle her. If he did, I feel like it would be terrible, actually. And we both really like the Eric romance.
Yes.
But still, he definitely wants her to prove herself. He doesn't just trust her to be a good leader right off the bat.
That's the main one that I think of too. I love that romance too as well. But again, nothing comes close to the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
For us, this Arcann romance is just top notch. I have one next question for you, and that is, what about this trope, the enemies to lover trope, is problematic?
That's such a good question, and we definitely need to talk about it, because as we said before, if you go looking for this trope online, you are definitely going to come across a lot of opinions that it is in fact toxic and problematic. And the first thing I want to say about it is, I think it's really important for people to keep in mind that anything that's depicted in fiction doesn't have to be pleasant. It doesn't have to be nice. It's okay to depict things that are in fact extremely problematic and toxic in fiction, because that's what we use fiction for. Fiction is supposed to be a mirror of the human experience, and the human experience is varied and complex and complicated. And I think there has to be room in fiction for things that are dark and unpleasant. I think it's very important, actually, to also engage with that. It's not fair to always expect characters to be likable, and it's not something that you really gain something from as a reader either. I think it's important to also sometimes engage with characters who are unreasonable and unlikable and who have toxic behavior. Having said that, I don't feel like this trope has to be either toxic or problematic. It definitely can be. It depends very much on how it's conveyed. When it is problematic, it's because something is a little bit off. And usually, to me, the thing that is off is the characterization. And I have to say, it's usually always the guy. It's usually always the guy that ruins this trope for me in fiction. Because the trope works if the guy is an alpha. And in a way, I don't like using that term, because I think it's a questionable term to use about human beings, because it's something that comes from, from the animal world, essentially being an alpha. But I think everybody knows what I mean when I say that, in the sense of an alpha male character being somebody who is a confident leader, who is powerful. But to be an alpha, the character has to be at ease with his power. And that's actually also the way it is in the animal world. An alpha in a pack is somebody who leads with compassion and competence.
And confidence. Yeah, absolutely.
And confidence. Somebody who keeps the pack together, not somebody who divides it and drives people apart. But for some reason, when authors try to write human beings, men who are alphas, they often make them what I would call an alpha asshole, pardon my language, but that's how it often comes across, because instead of being at ease with their power, they use their power to be domineering and disrespectful and belittling, especially towards female characters. And if the male character in a romance behaves that way, this trope is not romantic to me. If he does that, it's absolutely problematic. So, Bodie, can you think of any alpha a-holes that you have come across in SWTOR or fiction elsewhere?
Well, I gotta be honest. The first one that popped into my mind is Valkorion. And it's because of what you just mentioned previously, which I think is extremely telling and honestly very accurate. This individual's role in either being a unifying force, right? Or divisive. That's the first one that comes to mind. And that's a big one too.
It's a big one, and it's really interesting because there's no doubt that Valkorion is a unifying force to Soule as a whole, but to the entire galaxy, we know how divisive he is because he's masterminded all these wars, of course, across the galaxy and across the history of the story. And also, he's incredibly divisive within his own family unit. He does nothing but pit his children against each other and manipulate them and abuse them and push them towards the dark side. So absolutely an alpha a-hole in terms of being divisive within the family unit. Because what the true alpha, who is not an a-hole, is supposed to do is he's supposed to make his family unit feel safe and protected, without ever abusing his power or being domineering. And I think we can agree that Valkorion is the opposite of that. It makes you think of dating somebody in the real world that you despise. And that's an off-putting concept. I mean, if you think of a misogynist coworker who belittles you and orders you around, I mean, my gut reaction to that is yuck. I would not, want to read a story about that.
Yeah, that's not.
And romance fiction, I think, there's supposed to be a level of escapism to it. There's supposed to be something. It doesn't have to always be nice. It can be difficult. It can definitely deal with difficult emotions, and it can be very dark. But at the end, at least if there's a happily ever after, it's also supposed to have an element of something that is an escapist fantasy and something that you enjoy seeing. And I mean, I don't think anybody would enjoy seeing a relationship that's abusive. At least if it is abusive, it's not a romance novel anymore or romance story anymore. It's a different story. I mean, maybe it's a realistic depiction of an abusive relationship, but it's definitely not a romance story at that point. So what about Arcann then? Bodhi, what do you think? How does he fall into these categorizations? Is he an alpha? Does he ever behave like an alpha a-hole?
Well, Dark Times, I still don't think that he ever was anything remotely close to being considered an alpha a-hole in any regard.
No, I don't either.
I mean, otherwise it wouldn't be appealing in terms of this whole relationship romance thing.
Exactly. And I think the reason why, even though he definitely, injures our character very seriously and actually would have killed our character if you picked the light side choice in the confrontation with him on Asylum, where he impales our character, and we would have died if not for Valkorion's intervention. He also, throws us across the room, and he definitely does insult us sometimes. But his insults are on a level where I think you can argue that he still respects our character as a worthy enemy or foe on the battlefield, and he meets us as an equal on the battlefield.
Right.
It's never the alpha a-hole kind of belittling where he doesn't respect our character's intelligence or strength or anything like that. And I feel like we have that confirmed in the romance letter that he sends us after on Master Regret, where he says, all those years ago when we first met, I felt threatened by you, but I see now that I admired you even then.
Yes, that is a home run. That's a great find. And a great thing to bring up at this point, that he's always just had this respect. And again, back to Proclamation 3, that foundation of respect, which is fundamental for, at least for us, finding this whole romance to be extremely appealing, is that baseline of that respect, right?
Absolutely.
Even during dark times.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
So the question therefore is, why is Arcann's enemies to lovers romance not toxic? And I think we clearly have the answer to that. And but first, before you answer, I want to read you something. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
You're going to like this. The key difference between a toxic enemies to lovers rendition versus a healthy rendition is whether or not the object of affection has agency and self-determination. A toxic enemies to lovers trope puts the onus on one partner to fix the other, right? While a healthy enemies to lovers relationship stems from two people fixing themselves for themselves. The message that one's partner is not their therapist nor their tamer, which is great, way to phrase
Mhm.
this, is important to communicate. Last
Absolutely.
part of this is the story type. This story type gives hope to those who have made major mistakes in the past, those who feel as if they're not worthy of love, and those who are in the process of working through their intersocial issues. So
Yeah.
is that the key right there? Self-determination?
I think that's absolutely the key. And I feel like sometimes because I have seen people argue that there is something, or that there could be something about Arcann's romance that makes it abusive or problematic or toxic. And I strongly disagree, because first of all, the romantic relationship doesn't start until after he's redeemed and he has
Yep.
joined us. So it can never be an abusive relationship, because there is no romantic relationship while they're enemies, which is so important to me.
Yes. Fundamental.
Also, while they're enemies, they are enemies who fundamentally respect each other. And I think that's really important. And, please take this in, gentle listeners, always choose an enemy whom you can respect. You should never choose an enemy who is beneath you.
Yes.
Because,
It's very true.
Your enemies define you, right? I mean, the person that you devote your time to fighting, that says something about you. And I think that's also the case here. And then finally, as you said, the really important thing is agency. And the key thing with Arcann's romance is that it is not our character's love that redeems him.
Yes.
It's Senya that makes a sacrifice on Voss. It's the love of his mother, it's maternal love, which is the core wound that Arcann carries, and the core wound that turned him to the dark side in the first place, is the neglect and the lack of parental love. And that's what gets transfused into him in the Voss healing ritual.
Yes.
And that is a very different dynamic than if it had been more of a Beauty and the Beast type of narrative, where the woman had to be the civilizing agent who had to transform him and tame him.
Tame
that would
the
have been,
beast. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That would have been, and that's not what happens in the story at all. He doesn't need our character's love to be redeemed. All he needs is the chance from our character. All Senya needs is the chance to actually do what she needs to do in order for him to get to a baseline where he is mentally stable and healthy enough that he can start to work on himself. And then it's his choice to join us in the Dragon's
Well, and I'll go as far as to say that even before we even have any kind of say or decision, and when I say I mean our player character in the story, I'll make the argument that Arcann's self-determination, the choice, because of his, as we believe, his innate goodness deep within, that is his decision in that pivotal moment on his flagship, where he decides on his own volition to save Senya from Balin's attack. That moment right there is the critical moment, the catalyst moment for him, where he decided to make this decision for himself. And that's not something that our character did or forced upon him, or Senya forced upon him. That is him taking the first step. And that's a huge moment for this character.
Yeah, I mean, our character is not even in that scene, which I find really important, actually. And I think it's a good thing that our character is not in that scene, because it shows that what needs to be fixed is in Arcann's family dynamics. It's between him and Senya at that point, and our character really has nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
So all our character's love does after he's redeemed is that it elevates him and it gives him a new purpose, which is what we talked about in Proclamation 3, where we talked about the love convention being something that ennobles somebody and enhances a redemption arc. But it's not what redeems him.
Yeah, that's a critical takeaway in our opinion.
Yeah.
From this, and therefore we proudly proclaim in Proclamation 4 the Arcann enemies to lovers romance is therefore not toxic. Not toxic.
Yeah.
There we go. I do want to ask you briefly about one more thing here. When or how does this trope go wrong? Or specifically, you mentioned previously why do you think you can't find good examples of this trope in many other places, in places that you've looked?
That's a great question, because I really have looked. And again, I'm not somebody who generally goes looking for romance in fiction, but this is a trope that I feel like should appeal to me, because I like a high degree of emotional intensity between characters. And I do like, I think we also both like darker stuff in fiction. So because of that, I felt like this was a trope that should appeal to me. So I have gone looking for it, and I've especially looked for it after I enjoyed Arcann's romance so much. And I thought, oh, okay, this is something I like. I should see if I can find other examples of it. And I haven't found any. And I think maybe the reason it doesn't often work for me is because when I go looking for it in novels, for example, I feel like the author sets out to write an enemies to lovers story. And we know that that wasn't the case for the writers in SWTOR. We know that they didn't set out to write Arcann's story as an enemies to lovers.
That's a great point.
Story. And I think maybe that's why it works, actually, because that means that the stage where they're enemies is so developed and it's protracted. They go through a long period of being enemies and working through that stage and overcoming those obstacles before they get to the point where they can be lovers. And I think that's really important, because in most of the examples I've found, it feels like the writers skip past the enemy stage too fast, because maybe, I don't know, maybe there's an eagerness to see them just get to the, the point where they're lovers, because maybe there's a feeling that that's what the audience is there for.
You gotta sit back and enjoy the slow burn, people. Come on. That's what it's all about. It's not about the instant gratification.
Exactly.
Come on.
Exactly. And I think also for Arcann's story, what makes it work is that the initial reason why they were enemies to begin with, the obstacle that they had to overcome, it's such a huge thing that it keeps having a real impact on the relationship. I mean, even in something like Echoes of Oblivion, where Valkorion turns out to still not be entirely defeated, there's still an aspect of him out there. And that plays into the romance, and we get the impression that maybe Arcann could flip back. Maybe he could fall back into his old ways if he was pushed too much by the thing that initially made him fall, Valkorion, obviously. And that's really important, because that is something that means that this relationship keeps feeling, it retains its emotional intensity and the dynamics. It doesn't become stale. And for me, that's something that happens way too often when I come across this trope in other stories. It moves too quickly to the lover stage, and then it feels as if the initial enmity is forgotten about, like it no longer matters. Like, okay, we moved past this now, and now we can just go ahead and just have a regular romance. And that's not interesting.
Spark. It loses the spark way too fast.
Exactly. So I think that's it for me, in addition to the fact that most male leads in this romance trope tend to be alpha assholes, as we discussed before. And I don't feel like Arcann ever is. I think that Arcann operates during his dark times. I think he operates on the misguided belief that he has to step into Valkorion's role and he has to prove himself, and he does it in a misguided way, where he tries to be an alpha, an alpha kind of character like his father was, but because Valkorion was actually an alpha a-hole, it doesn't exactly work out that well. So Arcann obviously does act divisive as emperor. He exiles his own people, he starts a galactic war, etc. But as it pertains to our character, he never crosses that line, because there is that fundamental level of respect, and that makes it work.
And couple in the fact that we still firmly believe in his innate goodness, even during these times, just obscured by the cloud of darkness, I guess you could say.
Yeah, exactly.
He's just not fundamentally the same type of inherently, I guess the word is evil person like Valkorion is. It's just not the same.
Yeah.
I love this conversation, and I love this romance.
I do too.
This is what did you say earlier? Oh, the Holy Grail. I completely agree wholeheartedly. This is just the best. This is our bread and butter, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it is. And again, I just want to emphasize how unique it is to find something that works this well in a video game. of all the places you could go looking for a
Yeah.
trope done right, I think it's amazing to find it in Star Wars, and particularly in a Star Wars game.
Okay, well, thanks everybody so much for joining us. We'll be back again soon with another proclamation. Until
Yeah.
then, talk to you soon. Right?
Farewell for now.
This concludes another episode of Platform Six Cantina, a Star Wars The Old Republic podcast.